This conference will now be recorded.
Very good afternoon, friends, VDMA members, industry colleagues, dear participants. A hearty welcome to all of you for today's interactive webinar on new labor codes and new.
Manohar, you muted.
Yeah, sorry. And a hearty welcome to all of you for today's interactive webinar on new labor codes, a new beginning for India, which is a very hot topic and the most looked forward topic today in India at the moment. It's a pleasure to welcome our chief guest today, Mr. Peter Schmidt, Consul for Economics and Head of Administration at the German Consulate, Bangalore. Welcome, Peter. We also welcome our guest speaker today, Mr. Atul Gupta, a partner from the legal firm Trilegal. Also, very warm welcome to our own Mr. Rajesh Nath, Managing Director, VDMA India. This webinar, dear friends, is organized by VDMA India in partnership with Trilegal, a full-range legal services firm. We hope all of you and your families and working teams are all safe and doing well. I'm S. Manohar, based out of the Bangalore office of VDMA, and would be taking you through the initial part of today's webinar. Before I start, just a brief introduction about VDMA, which is the largest industrial association of in Europe. We have more than 3,348 members amongst us, cumulatively producing 230 billion of production in Europe across, employing 1.3 million people, and interestingly, 10% of the expenditure is on R&D, and also 78% of the production of all the German companies are exported out of Germany. We are a 127-year-old institution founded in 1892, and our entire activity is categorized into 38 specialized sectors. We are offices apart from India in the BRIC countries in China, Brazil, Russia, Japan, and Belgium. The topic of the discussion today, as highlighted here, dear friends, the program is as follows. We have the welcome address by Mr. Rajesh Nath, Managing Director, VDMA India, a keynote address on India and its partnership to Germany by Mr. Peter Schmidt, Consul for Economics and Administration and Head of Administration, German Consulate, Bangalore. And of course, the most important is the presentation on new labor law, the way we move forward in India, from Mr. Atul Gupta, the partner Trilegal. In the end, we would have question and answers consolidated and asked by Mr. Rajesh Nath to the speakers across. Dear friends, I request you all to keep yourself muted, keep your microphones in red, and also request you to post all your questions in the chat box there across. I would now like to invite Mr. Rajesh Nath a few sentences about him. He's been strongly promoting the Indo-German relations and has been the face of VDMA for 2 decades now. He has more than close to 3 decades of experience working in various industries across India and Germany. The most significant achievement of his career has been is according the award by the German president, which is the highest esteem order of the Cross of the Order of Merit, issued by him 2 years back. Over to you, Mr. Nath.
Yeah, thank you, Manohar, and hearty welcome to all our members and industry friends who have joined us for this very relevant and pertinent web seminar on new labor codes, a new beginning for India, being organized by the German Engineering Federation, VDMA, along with our reputed partner today, Trilegal. Pleasure for me to welcome Mr. Peter Schmidt from the German Consulate in Bangalore, and also Mr. Atul Gupta, partner at Trilegal. Friends, labor reforms in India have been a long pending demand of investors as they consider the country's labor and employment laws responsible for limiting investment interest by forcing private employers to be subscale and simultaneously creating a plethora of compliances and regulatory barriers. in this context, the consolidation of major central labor laws relating to wages, social security, industrial relations, and occupational safety and health is indeed a welcome step that underscores the government's attempt to boost ease of doing business and update domestic laws in order to bring them in line with the modern best practices. In order to simplify and consolidate the labor laws of India, the government has introduced 4 labor codes, which subsum 29 labor laws. A similar consolidation of central labor laws in 4 broad categories was earlier recommended by the Second National Commission on Labour in 2002, which led to the Ministry of Labour and Employment introducing 4 codes in 2019, which regulate wages, industrial relations, social security, and occupational safety, health, and working conditions. While the codes on wages 2019 was passed by the Parliament in 2019, the 3 other bills were referred to a standing committee on labour. These 3 bills were replaced by the government with the updated versions on September 19, 2020, based on the committee's recommendation, and were passed by the Union Legislature on September 23, 2020. Friends, these reforms allow industries flexibility in hiring and retrenchment. They will make industrial strikes more difficult by clamping new conditions and also expand the social security net for both formal and informal workers. Under the Industrial Relation Code, the government has allowed companies with up to 300 workers to fire workers or shut plants without the prior approval of the government. Hereto, prior approval had been required. Firms with more than 300 workers need to still apply for approval. However, if the authorities do not respond to their request, the retrenchment proposal will be deemed to be approved. In the case of manufacturing units, plantations, and mines with 100 or more workmen, layoffs also required government approval. However, there is a general feeling that 90% of India's workforce, which is employed in the informal sector, won't be affected by these changes. The look and feel of these codes may appear more as an act of consolidation rather than reforms. However, the codes introduce several changes that employers in almost all industry sectors, localization and size, will need to closely understand and implement. Hence, I'm sure our partners today, Tri-Legal, will delve in details and help us to understand the impact of these new labor codes. However, before that, I would like to request Mr. Peter Schmidt from the German consulate in Bangalore for his address on India, an important partner for Germany. Over to you now, Peter. I think Peter is having some issues. Yes. Yes, Peter. Yeah.
Yes, I can begin now. Mr. Rajesh Nath,
Yes.
the VDMA team and delegates present today for this session. Thank you very much for inviting me for this web seminar about the new labor code in India and to be a guest speaker at this event. I will give a short brief about a few aspects of Indian-German business relations and this Consulate General, my Consulate General. This session is about the new labor code in India, due to take effect beginning of April. Let me just draw your attention to a kind of related law we are just about to decide upon in Germany, with the plan to have it effective by beginning of 2023. It is the so-called Lieferkettengesetz, or law regarding supply chains. This law, based on a UN initiative, once coming into effect, shall ensure that in a production process, enterprises will observe human and labor rights, and not only in the production, but also of the supplier companies and individuals. This controversial law shall come into effect for companies with a minimum of 3,000 employees as from 2023, gradually including smaller enterprises with every year to follow. Let me share a few figures in German-Indian business relation, focusing on investment. India is a 0.3% investor of all foreign investments in Germany, ranking 27th and ahead of, for example, a German neighbor, Poland, but quite far off the figures of other Asian countries like Japan and China. But with a widespread portfolio project, 118 between 2015 and 2019. Thus, India has round about 600 companies in Germany, employing about 28,000 employees. The most attractive German federal state for Indian FDI are apparently Hesse, North Rhine-Westphalia, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and Lower Saxony. Let me now share that there are more than 200 German companies in Karnataka and around 1,600 across India. In India, it seems to be New Delhi, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh the places to invest by Germans. The major domains of Indian business in Germany is by business activity are sales, marketing and support, R&D and manufacturing, business services, and by sector, ICT and software services, business and financial services, and automotive sector. Healthcare is an upcoming domain. When it comes to trade, India and Germany see each other as strong trade partners. India is 27th partner country in exports to Germany and 23rd in receiving imports from Germany. To this overall picture comes the support by the leaders of both countries, Prime Minister Modi and German Chancellor Merkel. You know that Chancellor Merkel is in her last year of government. There will be a general election in September, and Merkel will not stand anymore. Before the end of, let's say, personal meetings due to Corona, now most meetings are virtual, but before the end of this, at the invitation of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has visited India from end of October to beginning of 2019, the fifth round of parliamentary consultation.
Request the people who are viewing, please switch off your mic. Yeah, sorry, Peter. Please continue.
Okay. Let me shortly draw your attention to the German Consulate General in Bangalore, whose general objective is to strengthen the existing ties between India and Germany. Since 2006, fully operational from 2011, the German Consulate General is here to serve. The numbers of contacts were constantly rising, as were the numbers of visa worked on. In 2019, around 43,000 visas were issued, which included work permit, business, family reunion, student, and tourist visa. Bangalore has seen the highest number of long-term residence and work permits applied for of all German missions in India. And this trend is continuing. Also, there are almost no tourist and Schengen visa issued at the moment due to the pandemic. Bangalore is leading again in terms of long-term visas operated. The new development in visa policy is that from beginning of April, short-term business and visitors visa shall be operated or processed completely at the Consulate General in Mumbai. That means all Schengen visas go to Mumbai. They are applied at the VFS business centers, but they are processed in Mumbai. The pandemic has given a tough time not only to the economic scenario, but strongly hampered our services as well. But somehow, with the reduced staff working in shifts, we are back on track, not only with visa, but also with other projects to follow. Bangalore again is leading among German missions in defining and co-financing, for example, small-scale projects in rural and health development, as well as a prominent promoter of both countries' university and R&D partnerships. Let me conclude in regard of this session by saying that I personally am very interested to hear about the new labor code in India, since it will affect German government and business operations in this country. Let me congratulate and thank VDMA team to host this session. And on behalf of the German consulate team, I wish you all the best and looking forward to an interesting afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for your address and updating us on the scenario in Germany. And I think very interesting what you mentioned also about the visa procedures and the changes that would be coming up. As you mentioned, for Schengen visas, the handling would be done from the Mumbai. And but also on behalf of VDMA, we would like to congratulate and compliment the consulate. Despite of the difficult situation, the still consulate is available for questions and queries and handling of the affairs. So compliments to you and the team also, Peter, for running the show under these difficult circumstances. And as you mentioned, you've been working in the shift. So thank you very much. Friends, now we come to Mr. Atul Gupta, who's the partner at Trilegal. Atul, the topic, what you have selected about the new labor codes, I think there is a lot of interest, especially the companies are looking forward what the new labor codes, what impact these new labor codes would have on the companies, and especially also when we are talking about ease of doing business in India. So Atul, over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Allow me a second to put up my presentation, please. I hope it's visible to everyone.
Yeah, it's visible.
Great. So, a very good afternoon, everyone. I am Atul. I'm a partner with Trilegal and lead their employment law practice. We're going to spend the next hour, the remaining time of the session, going over the labor codes, right? Now, as you would all know, the labor codes have been in the works for many, many years. These aren't a new concept, so to speak, right? However, the time that it has taken to create these codes has eventually now come to fruition, where we have 4 codes that have been passed by the parliament. They have all received presidential assent, and all that remains to be done is to enforce them and notify them. right? The anticipated timeline for notification of these codes was actually April 2021. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that that's going to happen right now. The various delegated legislations which are necessary in the form of rules that each state government needs to come out with aren't yet prepared, and interactions with the Labour Ministry have suggested that there will be at least a couple of months delay before these codes are actually enforced. In the meantime, various state governments have been implored by the central government to actually come out with rules which can then be enforced along with the central rules. So keeping that in mind, we potentially are not going to see these codes come into force from 1st April as was anticipated. However, the first question that people ask is, how new are these codes? Are they really rewriting the entire ambit of employment laws in India, or is this something which is mostly an incremental change, right? I think it's a mixed bag. On the whole, I think the codes are a net positive as far as industry is concerned, but there are certain elements of the codes which remain as before, despite industry and industry and association, various associations representing the industries, despite their feedback, they haven't been changed. So, for example, the requirement, and this is probably relevant for a lot of the participants here who run manufacturing setups, the requirement for any manufacturing setup or factory to seek prior government permission to retrench a single worker or to close down their operations, etc., all remains. The only change is that the employee threshold, the worker threshold, has been revised from 100 to 300, which, as you would know, many states have already done. But there are a lot of changes which we could argue as being progressive, adding greater clarity to how organizations can operate, and overall attempting to make labor relations more streamlined and easy. So let's take a look at each of these codes today, one by one. It's about an hour-long session with Q&A at the end. So there are limitations in terms of the level of detail that I could get into as we speak today, but I'd be happy to field questions towards the end. So the key highlights of the wage code, right? The first thing to bear in mind as far as the wage code is concerned is you have to, I'm sorry, I think the presentation may have, is the presentation still visible?
Yeah, the presentation is visible too, only the slide has gone back to the first slide. So you could,
is this?
Yeah, now it's, yeah.
Great, thank you. So as far as the key highlights of the wage code are concerned, the first and the biggest change that has been heavily debated as well is the concept of a floor wage. As minimum wages currently exist, each state government comes out with its own minimum wages. But the minimum wages vary depending on the nature of the industry involved, the skill and level of the worker involved. Even within the same state and city, the territory or the region, you know, the city center has a different wage code as compared to outer tiers of the city, right? This can prove to be quite challenging for organizations with varying minimum wages to follow and to keep track of and revise from time to time. Now, it also lends to disparity very often, where people doing the same type of job might get different minimum wages simply because of the location that they are working in. Now, what the new code is trying to implement is a concept of a floor wage, which will be stipulated by the central government. There could be, in theory, different floor wages for different geographical locations. So if indeed there are some regions which are not very well developed, and there is a merit in keeping a slightly lower floor wage for those regions, then the government could choose to do so. Now, once the government has stipulated a floor wage, the concept would be that the state governments cannot fix wages below that floor wage. What this is likely to do, and this is very similar to what you would find in foreign jurisdictions where there is a national minimum wage, is it might make industrialization across the country a lot more viable, because it is not going to then depend on wage arbitrage where there are lower wages versus higher wages, right? People may not necessarily need to migrate to the bigger cities to be entitled to larger wages, which will give industries access to greater talent pool even outside of the urban areas, and hopefully result in greater development throughout the entire length and breadth of the country and not just in certain pockets. So that's the concept. At least we will need to wait to see what actually is stipulated by the government as the floor wage and how the implementation of this occurs, right? The other change is that as compared to the current system where each state government comes out with its own notifications stipulating minimum wages for multiple industries, the schedules under the Minimum Wage Act can run into pages covering 40-50 different industries. Now this has been made agnostic. The wages will apply across the board, right? Hopefully, therefore, making things a lot more simpler in terms of implementation. One other change that one needs to bear in mind is, and for those who are familiar with the current Payment of Wages Act, there is a wage threshold which has revised over the years, but currently stands at 24,000. So nobody earning below about 24,000 is actually covered by the Payment of Wages Act in most parts of the country. Now, this threshold doesn't seem to find a place in the new wage code, which might mean that limitations around the deductions that you can make from people's salaries, and very often these are necessary for various reasons, such as people might have left without returning assets, people might not have served out notices. There could be a variety of reasons because of which an organization might want to make deductions from an employee's salary. And the way that the wage code seems to be written up is it suggests that those limitations will apply across the board and not just to a certain group or population of employees who earn below 24,000 rupees a month, right? The other change is that the current Equal Remuneration Act, which now becomes a part of the wage code, is not gender neutral. It only protects women. The wage code, however, is now making the concept of equal remuneration, equal pay for equal work, equal job opportunities gender neutral, meaning which it will protect men, women, transgenders, everybody. One interesting concept under the wage code is it's allowing a group of workers to come together and file a common claim, which is similar to what you would find in foreign jurisdictions as class action lawsuits. Which could make the risk associated with certain non-compliances that much greater for organizations. Currently, if one employee did not get his minimum wages or did not, get leave encashment or some other such dues which might be payable to him, they would typically have to file an individual claim. Many workers could file such claims together, and at best the courts will club those claims together, but and decide them under the same court or same judge, but they would all be independent claims. Now, what this is doing is it's sort of creating the concept of multiple workers coming together and filing a joint claim, which could increase the ticket value of each claim that an organization will face and potentially the cost exposure and liability as well. So that will make it that much more important for organizations to be mindful about their payment of wage practices, their minimum wage practices, etc., to avoid such kind of joint claims from workers. A few other changes are that the code now requires payment of wages to be the settlement of wages to be done within 2 days of even resignations, retrenchments, closures, etc. Previously, the law didn't specifically deal with resignations. Now, even if an employee quits on his own, they will need to settle their dues within 2 days. There is a revision to the definition of wages, which I will discuss towards the end of the session as well. There is a common definition of wage across all 4 codes, which is likely to have a financial impact on all organizations as they stand today. There could be impacts even in the manner of how you, for example, comply with minimum wage legislation, because, for example, currently the Minimum Wage Act includes HRA as a component of wages. But in the new definition of wages, the HRA component is treated as an exclusion. So it is a gray area as to whether or not, if I'm paying HRA to my employees, whether that should be counted towards minimum wages or not, right? There has generally been a sort of more changes across the code, including the wage code, on how soon employees will need to file their complaints because of potential non-compliances. The limitation period has been raised to 3 years as compared to the previous limits, meaning which employees will have a longer window of time within which they can raise claims. There has also been an increase in the overall fines that an organization may have to pay, right, for any sort of non-compliance. With the only relaxation being that previously under the existing laws, even the first offense could in theory result in criminal action. And that has now been only relegated to repeat offenses under the new law. And in fact, offenses of a certain kind could be compounded, right? So you don't necessarily need to undergo a full-blown criminal proceeding before the magistrate. You could come to a sort of settlement with the authority and pay a fine and end the matter. So this is certainly going to make life a lot easier, reducing the risk and headache of exposure to management and directors for non-compliances which might be inadvertent or something that might have simply missed attention. So those are the key highlights of the wage code. I would like to move on to the occupational health and safety code. This consolidates 13 different legislations relating to factories, contract labor, interstate migrant workers, etc. Right. One of the key highlights of this code is it talks about it helps in easing compliances in the sense that you don't need multiple different registrations under all of these laws. You can opt for one registration and one return, which can also be done now electronically. Deemed registrations will be awarded if the authorities do not respond to our applications within stipulated time periods. At the same time, what has been observed very often is in some industries, organizations fail to issue things like appointment letters to employees. There is lackadaisical compliance with health and safety norms. So the OSHW code is imposing clear obligations on employers to ensure that workplaces are free from hazards. Employees have been entitled to free annual health checkups. There are obligations on disposal of hazardous and toxic waste. And as I mentioned, organizations will be required to issue appointment letters to every employee. The progressive change here is that throughout the codes, transgender employees have received clearer recognition, and organizations are required to make facilities for them, like separate loos, etc. Right? So that's a progressive change. Working hours and leave entitlements have been prescribed under the OSHW code. These have largely been taken from the Factories Act. Now, because the Factories Act has been subsumed into the OSHW code, these are pretty much tallying those provisions, but we'll need to see whether there are going to be any changes at a state level, whether state governments will come out with any amendments or rules which might vary these limits in any form or manner. As I mentioned earlier, these aren't yet in the public domain. They haven't been formulated by many states, so we'll need to wait and watch as to what those rules are. I'll spend a little bit of time now talking about contract labor because that's a pretty significant change. I hope I'm audible. I just saw some comment saying that the voice is not coming through. Is that the case?
No, it's fine, Atul. You're quite
It's
audible.
fine, actually.
Maybe, yeah.
Great, thank you. So moving on, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about contract labor because this is a pretty significant departure from the current regime. Now everyone is familiar with the Contract Labor Regulation and Abolition Act, right? It's been around for decades. The way that the current law has been worded is, in spirit, it expects organizations to avoid hiring contract workers in core functions. But the actual implementation of the law is dependent on the government coming out with a notification under Section 10, stipulating those industries or functions in which the hiring of contract labor is prohibited or barred, correct? In the absence of such a notification from the government, it could be the central government for central government undertakings, state government for state undertakings and private establishments. In the absence of such such a notification, it's actually not illegal to hire contract workers even in core operations. Now we've seen that that has tended to therefore become the norm in many industries, also because it lends to a lot of flexibility. Because of the previously mentioned limitations around the flexibility to terminate the workers in factories above a certain threshold, organizations very often opt to hire contract workers because there is a greater flexibility in hiring them and removing them, right, without having to seek government permission. There is also, of course, sometimes cost benefits associated with hiring contract workers. Now, the government has essentially realized that this contract labor system has resulted in abuse at various levels. What they have therefore done is they have explicitly stated under the new codes that hiring of contract workers in core functions is prohibited. Now, there is one state already in Andhra Pradesh, where Telangana, where this has been a part of the contract labor law for many years, albeit with poor enforcement. Now, we'll need to wait and watch under the new code because this is now going to become the position throughout the country, how the enforcement around this will be. But it's certainly something that has caught a lot of attention, and organizations will be expected to take stock of their operations and figure out whether or not they're hiring contract workers in core functions. Do note that while hiring of contract workers in core functions has been prohibited, there has also been an easing or relaxation into what amounts to a contract, who amounts to a contract worker or labor to begin with, right? So there has been a change in the definition whereby people who are on the regular payroll of the contractor on permanent basis, not on a part-time basis, and who are receiving on increments, regular wages, appraisals, etc. from time to time. Meaning which, if there are people engaged by a contractor as their regular employees, not on fixed term arrangements or as consultants, etc., then those people will not fall into the definition of a contract worker to begin with, correct? So to that extent, there has been a relaxation, and to the extent that you can have arrangements with contractors where they deploy their own full-time staff as under service agreements, that would now fall outside the ambit of contract labor to begin with, correct? So it's a mixed bag in terms of a change where on the one hand you cannot hire contract workers in core functions, but on the other hand, if properly structured and engagements are with the reliable contractors, those arrangements itself might not fall within the ambit of the law to start with, right? There has been a relaxation of the compliance threshold also. It's been enhanced to 50 workers throughout the country. In many parts of the country, currently under the CLRA, it's still 5, 10, 20 workers, right? So that has been a positive change. There is also a provision for a single license on a pan-India basis rather than going state by state and trying to, obtain separate registrations and licenses. On the core activity bit, as I mentioned, there has been an absolute prohibition on hiring in core functions. The exceptions to this, which have been expressly called out in the law, include things like sanitation, courier, loading, unloading, transport, canteen, those types of services. Those have been recognized as being, falling outside the ambit of core operations. So organizations would be free to continue to hire contract workers for these types of operations. Now, because of this restriction, organizations will need to take stock and figure out whether they are indeed hiring people in core functions. Bear in mind that there are some exceptions that have been drawn out by the law. So for example, if activities are ordinarily done through contractors in the normal functioning of the establishment, right? Then hiring people as contract workers in those activities might still be permitted, correct? But this would be a very, very subjective assessment relying on how the industry functions, how contract workers are hired in that region, etc. Right? It's an analysis that has to be done based on a lot of statistics and data. Even the other exceptions could also include things like activities that do not really require full-time workers for major portions of the working day of a long periods, or even to deal with fluctuations in demand. So where you might suddenly need an increased employee headcount to deal with incremental orders, demand, seasonal fluctuations. Those would also not be hit by the restriction on hiring in core functions, right? There has been a bit of a flip in terms of how the health, safety, and welfare for contract workers has to be managed. The primary responsibility has directly shifted to the principal employer rather than from the contractor. So if you see the current law, contractors are obligated to provide canteens, restrooms, washrooms, etc. Now the law says, the new code say that the principal employer will be required to do so. As far as the obligation to pay wages is concerned, that hasn't changed. The contractor has to pay and the principal employer will only be responsible in case the contractor defaults, right? So that's a summary of the changes on the contract labor side, especially in the manufacturing sector. You will need to take a close look at what type of operations are currently being done in your factories and assembly lines through contract workers, and could they potentially be treated as being core, in which case you will need to start looking at alternate methods and mechanisms, which might include restructuring how you engage with the contractor or service provider. It might include maybe more fixed term hiring, etc. Right? It's a solution that will have to be determined for each organization based on its own specific requirements. There has also been a expansion on the definition of interstate migrant workers. Now everyone knows that the migrant labor was right at the forefront soon after the lockdowns happened last year, with a lot of migrant workers being left with no food, shelter, or access to income. So the codes have expanded the definition of migrant workers. They have defined it to include any person earning less than 18,000 per month who's directly or indirectly recruited to provide services in a different state compared to where they come from. It also includes people who might themselves, without the hiring or without the approaching of any vendor, who themselves might shift states and come to work. So someone who walks into Mumbai from a neighboring state will be deemed to be a migrant worker even if he's done so entirely on his own, right? So both the employers and the vendors are obligated to provide interstate migrant workers with the same benefits that are available to other workers. And in addition, they will be entitled to receive a journey fare or an allowance to make a trip back to their home states, right? Again, this is I think a direct result of what we saw during the pandemic, where migrant workers were left stranded, right, without any income. A few other progressive changes that organizations, mind you that the definition of contract labor also includes interstate migrant workers now. Sorry, I missed mentioning that earlier. Now, women, a few other progressive changes are that, previously factories in many states had needed specific permission to engage women during night shifts. The code is now making that universal, and women can be hired during the night as well, provided there is compliance with prescribed safety norms. As far as overtime practices are concerned, there are no substantive changes, so to speak. It's pretty much the same, where organizations will be expected to pay double wages for the people who work overtime. But the big change is that now employee consent is necessary before they can be asked to work overtime, which means that all of you as organizations will need to make sure that your contracts or your settlement agreements include specific verbiage stating that you have the right to make workers work overtime if required, right? And they will not have the ability to object to it. Again, as with the other codes, there has been a marked increase in the penalties that are attached with any form of non-compliance. However, there is also a concept of a grace period for compliance without the risk of prosecution, and certain offenses have been made compoundable, meaning which you can just pay a fine under a settlement with the authority without having to go through a formal prosecution. Let's spend some time on the Industrial Relations Code right now. This is one of the codes where I think some of the most significant changes have occurred, substantively at least, right? As anyone dealing with the manufacturing sector or setup would be familiar with, unions are fairly commonplace, and very often organizations have to grapple with which union to give recognition to, which union will be allowed to bargain on behalf of the workers. How do you deal with situations where there are multiple unions and politics around those where they're trying to be recognized and on the status of a bargaining agent? Very few states in India currently have formal rules around union recognition. Maharashtra, Kerala, and maybe a handful more. There is a informal code of conduct that the industry has tended to follow so far, but that has always been an informal code of conduct, right? Now, so a significant development under the new IR code would be the stipulation of formal rules around union recognition, meaning which now there is going to be a lot more clarity on how or which union has to be recognized and in what circumstances. So if there is only one registered trade union in an establishment, then the employer would be expected to recognize that trade union as the negotiating union of its workers. If there are multiple unions, then that union which represents 51% or more of the employees will have the ability to become the negotiating union. If there are multiple unions and no union crosses that 51% threshold, then all unions with all registered unions with 20% or more representation will have the ability to put forth its representatives and create what will be known as a negotiating council, right? So this is the framework that the new IR code is stipulating, which to my mind is going to make it easier for organizations to deal with multiple unions and lend a lot more clarity around it. The rules around certified standing orders the Standing Orders Act has also been subsumed into the IR code. Currently, there are varying thresholds as to when when certified standing orders have to be put into place. It varies from 50 to 100 to 200 in some states. Now, the IR code is making it clear that all establishments with 300 or more workers will need to obtain certified standing orders. So apologies. Yeah. The code has made it clear that establishments with 300 or more workers will need to obtain certified standing orders. The governments cannot reduce the threshold. The state governments cannot really reduce this threshold, but they can potentially choose to grant exemptions to at the state level, right? We'll need to wait and watch whether any state government does that. In my experience, the manufacturing sector at least has not enjoyed any exemptions so far. There have been exemptions granted to certain other categories of industries such as the IT, ITES industry in some states, but I very much doubt that the manufacturing sector is going to enjoy any sort of exemptions from this rule. So anyone who has a factory with 300 or more workers will need to obtain certified standing orders or adopt the model standing orders, right? There are a few other tweaks in terms of the fact that disciplinary proceedings have to be completed within 90 days from the date of suspension of a worker. There has been a revision in the limitation period where workers will have 2 years within which to file disputes, after which they will not be entertained. Hopefully, this will be a limit which will be also followed by the courts. Very often, courts today do condone delays. We'll need to wait and watch how it's interpreted as we move forward. One significant change, which is a departure from the current law, is all organizations with 20 or more workers will now need to create a grievance redressal committee mandatorily. It's not exactly a new provision. Section 9C of the Industrial Disputes Act already has this provision, but there is an exception built into that provision which says that organizations with their own existing mechanisms for grievance redressals need not create a committee, right, as prescribed under the ID Act. Now that exception has gone away, meaning which all establishments with 20 or more workers will need to create a GRC. This GRC will need to have representation from both the workers and the management. And in addition to having representation from the workers and the management, the decisions will have to, of the GRC will need to have majority approval of the worker representatives, right? Meaning which it's going to be a difficult task to deal with grievances at certain to some extent until and unless you are able to get your worker representatives to side with the management view, right? Please note that even grievances associated with potential retrenchment of workers can go to the GRC. So if someone has been dismissed or retrenched from the organization, as a first port of call, they can go to the GRC. Now, I think that's a sort of a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you will need to ensure that if you want to uphold that decision in an appeal, the worker representatives also side with the management, right, which can be an uphill task. At the same time, if indeed you're able to get even the worker representatives to agree with the management view, then it's quite possible that those disputes will not find too much success at a subsequent level before a labor court, because it's going to be very difficult for a worker to be able to argue before a labor court or a commissioner that even though the worker representatives have felt that the termination was justified and legal, it should be held as illegal, right? So the very fact that you get a stamp of approval even from the worker representatives can go a long way in ensuring that these disputes don't ultimately escalate to courts, or even if they do escalate, that you will win those, correct? So that's one of the benefits. It's a, like I said, a double-edged sword, but it comes with its benefits. Provisions around strikes have been made a lot more beneficial for management as a whole. The current regime was that until and unless you are a public utility service, right, there was no requirement for workers to give any sort of formal or advance notice of a strike, and they could commence strikes immediately if they wanted to. Right now, of course, there are various rules around what is an illegal strike, what is an unjustified strike, so on and so forth. But now the change that has been brought about by the IR code is that they will have to be a advance notice of a strike. Further, activities which aren't ostensibly strikes, but where people just go on mass absenteeism or go slow, etc., have been expressly recognized as forming as being strikes in themselves, right? So I think all of these changes are very positive and would help in avoiding unexpected or unanticipated disruptions in business and giving both the workers and the management a better window of opportunity to try and negotiate and close out disputes, correct? There has been a minor revision in the definition of who is a worker. The previous term was workman. They have made it now gender agnostic and they've used the term worker. But otherwise, the definition is largely similar, with the only big tweak being that currently people in a supervisory capacity earning up to 10,000 rupees are treated in the workman category. Anyone above 10,000 in wages in the supervisory category is a non-workman. Now that 10,000 threshold has been revised to 18,000. One other change is again associated with the introduction of a reskilling fund. And once again, I think this is a sort of a result of the pandemic and the significant job losses that were seen. The government has decided that people who are made redundant or retrenched should have access to some form of opportunity to increase their skills and marketability, towards which organizations will now need to pay 15 days salary in addition to the retrenchment compensation into a reskilling fund, after which it will be passed on to the worker, right? So that is going to increase your cost towards the retrenchments. Now let's move on to the definition of wages under the Social Security Code and generally a discussion on the Social Security Code, right? I'm going to discuss the definition in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but generally the definition of wages has been expanded such that it is going to potentially have an incremental impact on things like provident fund, gratuity, leave encashments, etc., right? There are two components to the definition of wages. Let me move to the next slide, where there are certain inclusions, right, which are essentially all those components of wages which are expressly agreed in your contract of employment and are in a sense guaranteed components of wages, right? So long as the worker is abiding by the terms of employment and is assured to get those payments, those will be treated as wages. Some specific inclusions that have been called out are basic pay, dearness allowance, and retaining allowance, correct? There is a long list of exclusions. Again, not very new, because a lot of this has been copy pasted from existing laws, correct? There is a long list of exclusions which include components such as conveyance allowance, house rent allowance, statutory bonuses that are not assured under a contract, sums that have been paid to defray special expenses, overtime allowances, provident fund and pension contributions, commissions, remuneration paid under an award or settlement. I'm not really sure why that is an exclusion, but unfortunately it is. Value of house accommodation, gratuity, and other sort of compensation paid at the time of exit, like retrenchment, ex gratia, retirement, etc. Right? Now, what the new wage definition has done is it has said that if the payments under the exclusions, starting from exclusion A to I, right, as you can see under the exclusion bucket, exceed 50% of the gross remuneration, then they will also be treated to be a part of the wages, correct? I will demonstrate this further with an example in the next slide. In addition to that proviso, there is also a proviso which says that if there are remuneration paid in kind, then to the extent that they don't exceed 15% of the total wages, those will also be treated as part of the wages, correct? Now let's take a look at a live example to help understand this better. Now, if we were to take a look at this sample pay structure where basic pay is 40,000, house rent allowance is 30,000, conveyance allowance is 20,000, and employer's contribution to PF is 10,000, right? These are all, of course, hypothetical figures. And the total gross is 1 lakh, right? Under the current regime, you would pay, for example, provident fund or only on the basic. With the coming of the 2019 Vidya Mandir case, you might have had to pay provident fund on some other additional components, but let's keep that aside for the moment. You would pay gratuity at least purely on the 40,000 pay limit, because that's how gratuity is payable on the basic pay, right? Now, under the new definition, right, house rent allowance, conveyance allowance, and employer provident fund contributions are explicitly called out to be exclusions, and they've been highlighted in green. Basic pay or basic salary is explicitly called out as an inclusion, and that's highlighted in red. Now, if we were to understand this better, the way that the proviso is worded, it says that if the sum total of some of the exclusions from A to I, correct, exceed 50% of the gross, I'm getting a message saying that screen sharing is now paused. I'm not sure why that's the case.
No, but we are able to see.
It's fine. Yeah, Atul, it's fine. You can carry on.
Okay. Sure. So as you can see from the example, in this case, the exclusions, which are HRA, conveyance, and employer PF, are coming to 60,000, which therefore are more than 50% of the total gross, right? Now, because of this new definition, that portion of the exclusions that are more than 50% of the total remuneration will also have to be treated as part of the wages, correct? Meaning which in this example, an additional 10,000 rupees will need to be treated as part of the wages. So because of this new wage code, because of this new definition, you will have to now start paying gratuity on 50,000, not on 40,000, as that would have been the case in the previous under the Payment of Gratuity Act so far, correct? So this is a direct example of how your cost is likely to go up, and there could be similar implications for other components of pay as well, right? Depending on what your current wage structure is, what your wage employee salary thresholds are, so on and so forth, correct? Now, because of this, the logical approach for organizations is going to be to structure their wage in a manner that the number of guaranteed or included components do not already exceed 50%, right? That way you can take a benefit of the proviso and limit the components on which you actually pay gratuity and other benefits to 50% of the wages. If hypothetically your wage structure was only to cover, let's say, basic and DA, and that was 100%, then you would have to pay gratuity on 100% of the wages, correct? So there is no logical merit in structuring salary in a manner where a very large component is treated as included or guaranteed components, correct? Now, you will therefore need to look at your wage structure and assess each of your current components to see whether they are part of the inclusions, whether they are part of the exclusions, whether they don't fall under any bucket, and try and tweak it to the extent possible to mitigate your overall cost impact, right? As far as Provident Fund is concerned, there is a lot of questions that people ask, is my Provident Fund bill going to go up? It certainly can go up when it comes to international workers, because there is no limit on how much PF they have to be paid. For your domestic workers, if they are already earning a basic salary of 15,000 or more, meaning which if you're already paying them 1,800 rupees per month as PF, then potentially there is going to be no impact, at least for the foreseeable future, because the codes have said that the existing scheme provisions will continue to apply. Now, in the future, if that 15,000 wage threshold is revised and made 25,000 or something else, then yes, once again, there could be a cost impact, incremental cost impact, correct? One other important factor to consider, and this goes hand in hand with the discussion around contract workers and how you will structure your org chart, is there is a greater recognition now for fixed term employees. Now, the concept of fixed term employees is not exactly new. There has been a lot of fixed term employment in the industry historically too, but there have been disputes around that, right? So therefore, the government attempted to amend the standing orders to allow for fixed term employment even before these codes. Now, similar provisions have found their way into these codes, and they have said that people can be hired on a fixed term basis, provided that they receive gratuity and other benefits on a pro rata basis, even if they do not complete the 5-year tenure. So if you hire someone on a fixed term basis for 2 years, they will still be entitled to gratuity at the end of those 2 years. Further, it has been made very clear that fixed term employees will have to get the same benefits as regular employees. So you cannot shortchange your fixed term employees in any form or manner, right? There is also provision suggesting that conversion of regular jobs into fixed term employees is going to be frowned upon. It might not be easy, so you can't just say that you're all my permanent employees, I'm now going to convert you to fixed term employees. That's not going to be easy. But you could potentially consider changing some of your existing contract workers into FTEs or fixed term employees, where, for example, you only need them for 6 months to a year or some fixed duration, and not necessarily for long periods, right? You could hire them as fixed term employees instead. There are provisions allowing organizations to use common creche facilities, so each entity doesn't have to create its own creche, which I think was anyway being done practically, but now there is a clear recognition of that. And there are newer provisions which will make hiring of gig workers and consultants, etc., a little bit more clear, with fewer disputes potentially, because these types of workers have been given an explicit definition and recognition under the law. So if somebody were to hire consultants, they could be classified as gig workers. If someone were to hire drivers, etc., through platforms, right, they would fall under the category of platform workers. Now, of course, that comes with the incremental obligation to extend social security benefits to these workers. Schemes will be framed on what those social security benefits are and how they will be implemented. There is no clarity on that so far, but there will be an ability to hire such workers with a lower risk of any kinds of claims or disputes arising tomorrow, that I should be given the same status as permanent workers, right? So that sort of brings me to a sort of conclusion on the key highlights of these codes. I think the key takeaways or steps that you all have to plan for is conduct a detailed wage assessment to identify where you are potentially going to face greater cost liability and how you can mitigate that. It's important to go and get legal opinions around that. I think I'm getting comments that are you able to see the slides?
Yeah, visible.
So I think the key steps are to do a detailed assessment of your current wage structures, right? Now, for those in the manufacturing setup where you may have binding settlements in place, this might not be easy to do. You can't just unravel your wage settlements and try and revise those. But there will be a lot of your staff who are not bound by wage settlements, or where your settlements are coming up for renewal. you have to take a closer look at how those are structured, what components should be treated as inclusions, what should be treated as exclusions, and how you could potentially try and mitigate your overall liability for things like provident fund gratuity, etc. Engagement of contract labor will certainly require a thorough and deep assessment. What type of contract workers can you continue to hire? What might be problematic because they are in core functions? Could engagement of some contract labor be allowed under the exceptions that we talked about as industry practices? Could some contract labor arrangements be restructured from pure play manpower supply to service agreements, where the contractors undertake to hire them as permanent employees on its own payroll, give them regular increments, etc. Right? So you will need to do a thorough look at your overall org chart and structure and see whether people need to be engaged in some other capacity instead of contract workers as fixed term employees, consultants, etc. Right? You should also do a full-fledged review of your HR policies. There could be tweaks and improvements to make in those spaces. The new codes, for example, the new codes make it clear that anyone accused of sexual harassment will not be entitled to statutory bonus. Those types of provisions can come in. There can be limits drawn out for when to complete disciplinary inquiries, so on and so forth. Most importantly, you will now need to create a grievance redressal committee with both worker and management representatives, and that will require some careful planning, right? For those who don't already have unions, this is that much more something that needs sensitive handling, because workers will have to elect their representatives, and very often doing so is done through creation of a union as a first step. Right, so how you handle identifying worker representatives will require some careful thinking and planning. So that sort of brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Atul. I think excellent presentation, and we've received actually a lot of questions. So it's quite a tough task now to select which questions to take and which not to take, Atul. And also, just for your information, Atul, we had almost about 180 participants. I think this was really a hot topic and drew a lot of interest among our members. Atul, let's quickly, there are many questions which are similar in nature. One question which several people have asked is, after these changes, Atul, the salary structure, what should be an optimal salary structure? So I don't know, would you just like to say a few words on that, Atul?
Yeah, so sure. I mean, it's difficult for me to recommend a salary structure, sort of like a one-size-fits-all formula, right? The salary design is going to be a very entity-specific exercise. But my recommendation, as I mentioned, would be there's no longer any benefit in having a very large basic salary, right? It doesn't make sense to have guaranteed components which are exceeding 50% of the wages, because the moment you do that, they all fall within the inclusion bucket, and you have to then start paying things like gratuity, etc., on a very significant portion of your wages. The way that the wage definition is structured, it's now giving organizations the ability, of course, with some limitations, to structure your salary in a way that you don't have to go beyond 50% of the gross when it comes to payment, of various compensation towards the end of service, like gratuity, leave, retrenchment, etc. Right. So I think the optimal structure would be to structure your pay in a manner where you have certain components which are expressly recognized as exclusions, such as HRA, conveyance, etc., as hard coded into your pay structure, right? In addition to basic salary, and try and build in other components which fall within the heading of a exclusion, right? So for example, the exclusions include items like payments made to defray expenses, right? Special expenses associated with the job. So again, has to be very organization specific, but payments made to employees towards commuting, towards uniform, towards books, periodicals, all of those, if you can legitimately argue to say are expenses that employees are forced to incur as part of their job and task, and I'm paying some money to them to defray those expenses, then those will fall into the exclusion bucket, and you don't then need to count those when you're calculating gratuity, etc. Correct? There might be merit in paying a larger portion as provident fund, because that's also an exclusion. But the flip side is that provident fund is not cash in hand for employees, so employees might not necessarily find that very favorable. It will increase their savings, but it might also reduce their cash in hand, right? But in today's day and age, where a lot of people are working remotely, there is a lot more ability for organizations to, for example, offer things like phone allowances, internet allowances, which could be, with the right contractual structuring, policy structuring, and safeguards, be argued to be excluded components because they are being paid to defray expenses, right? So you could, for people who are working remotely, you could offer them a work from home allowance or an internet allowance, because they have to spend money to be able to do their job. They have to buy internet plans, they have to buy tables, chairs, they have to incur expenses for basic apparatus, all of which normally an employer would have been required to provide, correct? So there is therefore an ability to do some smart planning around how you structure your salary without violating the law, without necessarily reducing the amount of money that people in the cost exposure to organizations because of the revised definition of wages. Again, I mean, like I said, this has to be a very entity and case specific assessment, but my broad outline and suggestions are what I just mentioned.
Okay. In fact, related to that, there are several questions which have come, which point to the same issue. Atul, how much percentage impact would there be approximately on CTC of individual employees? Can one give a rough figure or percentage? Is it possible?
Not really. See, I mean, I see organizations with varied CTC structures, right? Some include gratuity in the CTC, some don't. Some have 50% basic, some have 25% basic, some have 40% basic. So, I mean, your CTC doesn't necessarily need to change at all, honestly, right? All that the law is saying is that if the components of your salary are structured such that more than 50% are falling into the exclusion bucket, then some portion of those exclusions should be treated as wages and as part of the inclusion. So technically, there is no requirement for you to actually revise your pay structure if you don't want to. You would want to, however, try and change that pay structure only if you want to reduce the cost exposure to organization. So if I'm already sitting with a salary with 50% basic and 20% special allowance, right, I'm then going to have to pay gratuity on 70% of the wages. Do I need to do that? I don't. If I can smartly structure my salary such that my inclusions and what is treated as part of wages sits below the 50% mark or equal to the 50% mark, then I'm saving money. So that's what organizations will need to do. I don't see any impact, so to speak, on the CTC. If you are not really that keen to save money, you could continue with the existing CTC as well. Nothing says that I necessarily need to show a basic salary component as equal to 50% of my gross. That's a misunderstanding that's floating around the market.
Then I think another question that has come in, Atul, is there a limit in time of contract for fixed term employees?
That's a good question, and I wish that something was stipulated in the law. Unfortunately, there hasn't been. There were actually representations made to this effect where people said that, you know, stipulate a 1 year, 2 year and a limit, or stipulate a limit on how many times a fixed term contract can be renewed, right? Unfortunately, nothing has been prescribed in the law. What that means is there could be future litigation and disputes where organizations use the fixed term contract structure but repeatedly keep renewing the contract. So I will hire someone on a 1 year contract. Then once the contract expires, after a week, I will renew it, or after 2 weeks, I will renew it. I will hire him again on a 1 year contract, and I will keep doing this, right? Now, there is precedent, however, already existing. Indian courts have already reviewed these types of arrangements and said that if there is an abuse of these types of process, then we will treat the arrangement as sham and we will consider that person as your full-term employee, right, or a permanent employee. So,
Mr. Atul Gupta. Hello, Mr. Atul Gupta. What is the
hi.
procedure? How?
Yeah.
I think someone was asking a question, but then they got muted. So
Yes. Yeah, we've asked him to put it on the chat box, so we'll take it from the chat.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question.
Then I think, right. I think the last part got, you were just explaining the last part when the interruption came. So would you just like to clarify that?
Yeah, so I was trying to say that there is already existing precedents by courts where they have said that, you know, abuse of contract labor or, you know, fixed term contract arrangements could be challenged. So organizations will therefore need to be mindful that when they are hiring people as fixed term employees, they don't try and do repeated renewals. Also, there isn't any real benefit in doing that anymore because you have to pay gratuity, right, every time a fixed term arrangement comes to an end. So there is a cost implication to it. The only reason why you would want to repeatedly renew a fixed term contract and argue that it's a fixed term contract is if you want to avoid paying retrenchment compensation towards the end. And that's where I feel that there is a risk that repeated renewals of fixed term contracts could be challenged and people could say that I am like a permanent employee and therefore the same rules of termination should apply to me as they would to any other full-time employee.
I think a related question there that has come in, is it only for the purpose of gratuity calculation we have to apply this inclusion exclusion rule?
No, for practically everything. PF, ESI, leave, components, gratuity, bonus, all of this, it's now a consistent common definition of wages across all codes, right? And in a way, this has created some very absurd outcomes. So for example, HRA is treated as part of the wages when it comes to payment of wages obligations, correct? But for some reason, it's not clear whether it will be treated as part of minimum wages. Now, if a woman goes on maternity benefit, she would normally also get her HRA because that's part of her wages. Now, is maternity benefit going to be equated with wages, or is it going to be a separate benefit and therefore I will say HRA is excluded? There are some gray areas because of this common definition that has come forth. But the same definition, same approach of exclusion, inclusion has to be applied across the board. As mentioned in my slide, some components are excluded, but they have, by virtue of a proviso, been treated as part of the wages for certain purposes. So when it comes to determining whether I'm following equal remuneration practices, or when it comes to claim for payment of wages, some of the excluded components have also been treated as part of wages, like HRA, payments under settlements, overtime allowances, etc.
Atul, I had just one suggestion, since there are too many questions that are there and very interesting questions, and I'm sure our audience is also looking for a reply. We still have about almost 150, more than 150 people who are online. Maybe, Atul, if agreeable to you, we could send across these questions, some questions, say 7 or 8 important questions. Are you agreeable, Atul? You could prepare the reply, we can, as a short document, and then we can share this with the participants. Would that be fine, Atul?
No problem, but again, I mean, these will have to be very high level, right? Unless and until there are
Yeah, of course.
So I am happy to put together brief answers and share them, no problem.
Right. So that I think largely because many of the questions are repetitive or similar in nature. So we can club it together maybe as 5 or 6 questions and send it to you. But perhaps
Sure.
the last question, Atul, yeah.
Don't ask me to recommend a paste.
No, that's okay. I think there are other questions also we can take up, Atul. Maybe last question, Atul, because many manufacturing companies have joined. And so the question is, we are a manufacturing company and contractual employees are directly involved in our production. So what is now going to be the impact on us?
Yeah. So if you have contractual workers engaged in your production, right? The two things that you need to firstly check is, are these production activities that are being done both by your permanent workers as well as contract workers? If yes, it's a clear-cut indication of the fact that it's a core operation which already justifies you hiring permanent workers on your own payroll, right? Which means there is a very real risk that those contract workers can argue that hiring them as contract workers any further is illegal and violates the codes, right? The exception to hiring contract workers will therefore have to be examined, whether you could argue that it's my practice falls under one of the exceptions. If you're hiring contract workers for production activities for limited durations in the year because there is a greater demand, larger number of orders, then that should be fine. But if it's on a permanent ongoing basis, it's very likely that it will violate the law. You will either need to move those people into maybe your own payroll as fixed term employees, or you will need to completely restructure the arrangement with the manpower agency. You will need to see if you can restructure that arrangement so that it falls under the new definition of contract labor, which fundamentally excludes anybody who is a permanent worker on the payroll of their of the vendor or the contractor, right? And who is getting regular increments, hikes, bonuses, incentives, etc. Right? Now, this is difficult to do if the contractor is also hiring them on back-to-back contracts, saying the moment your the moment the client terminates the arrangement, I will also terminate the arrangement, right? Then that falls outside the, then you can't take the benefit of that kind of definition. So long as the contractor is willing to hire or show them as permanent long-term employees, not hired exclusively for your industry or your entity, then you could argue that they are not even contract workers to begin with. So even if they are engaged in a core function, then maybe that doesn't matter, right? But those are the limited exceptions. You could also try and examine if that is something which falls into the common industry practice exception, but that's a very, very gray area of the law. We don't know how that is going to be interpreted and applied. The next thing to do, of course, is wait and watch, because like I said, in some states, there are already such limitations saying that you can't hire people in core functions, contract workers in core functions like Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. But enforcement is poor. We'll need to see how enforcement is going to be of these new codes. And if indeed there is strict enforcement, then by all means you will be forced to then restructure your contract labor hiring practices.
Maybe Atul, the last question I wanted to ask you is, do we know when the codes would be implemented? Because I think there's still not much clarity on that. No?
True, it was anticipated that they will be implemented from April. There has been no formal communication from the government. All that we have seen and heard is stuff that has been reported in papers through, informal discussions with ministry officials. The suggestion has been that because states haven't come out with their own rules, the codes will be delayed by a couple of months. The suggestion is that the indication is that they might come into force after the assembly elections, provided the various state governments, or at least some of the major state governments and industrial hubs, have come up with their own rules. Right? That's the indication. It's anybody's guess, but my sense is it's going to take another 2 to 3 months at least.
2 to 3 months. Okay. So probably from mid of the year, June or July, perhaps, could be a indicative period. Fine. Yeah, Atul, I think thanks a lot for the that you took so many questions and replied them so competently. I think certainly this session drew a lot of interest of our members and the friends from the industry. So I would just like to conclude. So friends, India is one of the most labor-intensive countries in the world, and we've finally taken a leap of faith and codified our multiple national level labor laws into 4 codes. Now, this is certainly a bold and progressive move, given that several labor laws were almost 70 to 80 years old and enacted largely in the industrial era. Indian economy has changed considerably since then, and finally, it's time for our labor laws also to change. On behalf of the German Engineering Federation, first of all, I would like to thank both our speakers, Mr. Peter Schmidt from the German Consulate and Mr. Atul Gupta, partner at Trilegal, and thank you, Trilegal, for partnering with VDMA for this very important and relevant web seminar. I would also like to thank all our participants. As mentioned, we had more than 180 participants, and in fact, till the very end, we had almost 150 participants logged on. And Atul, this is a commendable, I think, commendable circumstance that more than 150 people, or 90% of the participants, are there till the end. So compliments to you for making the topic so interesting. So wishing all the participants and friends from the industry, as the financial year is going to come to an end, wishing you all success in the last push to achieve your goals and targets for the financial year. Stay well, stay healthy, and stay connected with VDMA. And thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Atul and Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank
have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.